Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It sounds like a big-time, big-city stadium rock show. And it's actually pretty much the total opposite of that. For instance, instead of stadiums, it's tiny little venues or even just a gathering in the park. Instead of big cities, it's mostly been the small towns down the highway from them. And instead of great rock music, it's mostly just racism. Welcome to the ridiculously named Road Rage Terror Tour, a cross-country adventure from a far-right extremist group that believes some genuinely disturbing things. But if you ask them about them, it's just a joke. Why are you so mad? So who's behind the Terror Tour, and what is the actual goal here? Why call it that? How is this trip actually being received in towns across the country? And a question I ask myself: how should we discuss things like this? How much oxygen should the media give this kind of display? Are we doing exactly what they want us to do? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Jen St. Denis is a reporter with the Tyee who has been, I guess, following the West Coast leg of the Terror Tour, Jen.
Yes, that's right.
What exactly is this, and why are they calling it the Terror Tour? That seems like not a great name.
Yeah, so this is a in-person tour of Canada by this group called Diagolon. And this kind of a mocking name to them. The full name is the Road Rage Terror Tour. These events have been organized by this group of extreme right live streamers, and they're just very openly racist. They often dwell on fantasies of violence and mass deportations of immigrants. They use humor, though, to make their live streams sort of more entertaining, and it also provides them this shield for any criticism. They can respond like, oh, we're just joking around when they're criticized. So it's called the Terror Tour as a joke, but it also points to the way this group often uses violent imagery. So for instance, in the event poster, they have this Diagolon flag in the background, and the white slash on the Diagolon flag is like flecked with blood. So that's just a typical kind of mixing like humor with this really vile kind of ideology.
Okay, well, I might regret this, but for those who haven't dug into this and aren't online, probably thankfully for them, explain to us what Diagolon actually is. What is this philosophy?
So they're this group of live streamers. They were originally called the Plaid Army, and the name Diagolon refers to this imaginary country that they were kind of musing about one day that would run from Alaska to Florida, kind of having to do with having less like COVID-19 restrictions or no restrictions, I guess. I'd say they came to prominence during the 2022 Freedom Convoy protests. What they're all about, if you watch their live streams, you'll just see that they're extremely racist towards numerous groups. They make lots of anti-Semitic comments. Recently, they've been really, really focused on South Asian people, which is a huge concern to me, especially in BC. A lot of targeting, especially South Asian politicians. The RCMP has described them as this militia-like network with supporters who subscribe to accelerationist ideologies. So that's the idea that there needs to be this civil war or collapse of Western governments. It's inevitable and should be sped up. And if you'll recall, during the Freedom Convoy protest in Coutts, Alberta, 4 people were actually arrested and charged with conspiracy to kill police officers. And Diagolon's patch, this sort of black background with a white diagonal slash, was found on body armor belonging to some of the people arrested. But it's important for us to note that none of the people we're talking about today were part of that group that were arrested.
Who are we talking about today then? You mentioned they're a bunch of live streamers. That's their primary mode of employment or focus?
There are these people who do these incredibly long live streams. I've been joking to my colleagues that the worst thing about covering this is having to sit through these things. They're incredibly boring and as well as being very disturbing. But the key people organizing this in-person tour are Jeremy McKenzie, Alex Friend, Derek Harrison, aka Derek Rance, and then Mackenzie's girlfriend, Morgan Guptill. Jeremy Mackenzie is probably the most charismatic of the group, and he's probably the one who's like sort of been in the media the most as well. When you watch his live streams, he'll sort of be making jokes and sarcastic comments, but then he'll just suddenly switch to just being angry and saying extremely racist things. And it kind of comes out of nowhere. It's like one moment he's joking around and the next moment he's quite angry. Alex Brand, I'd say, is much less charismatic. He recently filmed himself laughing at graphically violent videos of people in India getting hit by trains. So that's who he is. Derek Harrison, well, when he was on tour with this group in BC, he went to a residential school memorial and made horrible, horrible comments. So that's just who these people are. They're just extremely, extremely racist, and they're not concerned at all about hiding it.
Is this like specifically just exist to provoke people with these views or what?
Yeah, I talked to some extremism researchers about this, and the person I talked to said that it's important to have these in-person events for these kind of groups because it allows them to get off of the online world, meet people in person. It can also be lucrative. They're selling tickets for this tour for about $60 each. And you'll notice in some of the photos we've seen of the tour, they're selling merchandise too. They're selling T-shirts and things like that. They advertised on social media sites like X for the tour. They're supposed to go to cities across Canada. But in reality, what we've seen is that they've been showing up kind of in smaller communities.
Yeah, tell me about that. Where are they going and what is it like on the ground? Like, what are they actually doing?
In their promotional materials, they were supposed to hit pretty much every major city in Canada, as well as some sort of smaller towns like Kamloops and Hamilton. But in reality, what they've been doing is kind of showing up and going to event venues that are more outside the urban core. So like in Ottawa, they showed up in Carp, which is this very small town outside of Ottawa, like kind of a farming town. The Vancouver event was held in Langley, which is about an hour away. And in some locations, so when they showed up in Sudbury, they actually found the doors to the venue they'd rented were locked and they weren't able to hold their event. But then in other places like in Carp and in Langley, they've been able to book these small community venues. And it's kind of awful because these small halls are run by volunteer groups who obviously don't have a lot of resources and probably knowledge about that this could even happen. And it seems like they have sort of, obviously not booked these halls under with any kind of like knowledge of like what's actually going to be happening. And then in some other locations like Kelowna, they've just been gathering in like a public park. And that's kind of harder to prevent because there's obviously they can gather. That's totally legal. But then we've seen some people, we've seen people in Kelowna able to warn people that this is happening, like with a post in Reddit. So at least the community knows.
When we say they're able to gather, what kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Well, we have a photo from the event in Langley. They posted it themselves on their own social media. So we have that from them. And it shows about 50 to 60 people gathered in this hall. So that's the kind of numbers we're talking about, I guess.
Do we know what occurs when they gather? Are this just like public speaking? Are they organizing? What are they actually doing when they get into a venue?
Well, journalist Rachel Gilmore, who really, really tracks this stuff closely, she was able to actually get leaked audio of their event in Carp. And it was very similar to like their live streams. It was kind of like joking around, but like extremely tasteless anti-Semitic jokes. There was some talk about like being proud in your own culture. And Rachel, her analysis was that meant like white culture. So that's the it's just basically they're like, it is probably like an in-person version of their live stream is kind of the sense I get.
And you mentioned that posts kind of go up warning venues or even just warning the community. What happens when word begins to spread that the Road Rage Terror Tour is coming and, these are the people involved in some of their views?
Well, in some cases, the police have kind of monitored the event. So I think that happened in Carp. Obviously, like it's legal to kind of gather and speak, and there are hate speech provisions, but you'd have to kind of really closely like monitor and record the event to like really understand whether that could be an option. When we talk about like preventing them from using venues, a lot of the venues do have these code of conduct provisions that say like preventing harassment and discrimination. So I suppose like communities could use those, but a lot of times they don't know, right? They don't know who this group is. And even if they did know, the group might use some sort of like, bait and switch, like using another name to book the hall. So a lot of the communities did not know, even though there had been a little bit of media about the fact that this tour was going to be happening. When I talked to the mayor of Langley, he had never heard of this group until he saw it being talked about on Twitter.
How far are they into this tour and how long is it supposed to last for? And I think back to the Ottawa convoy and obviously the stated goal, regardless of all the stuff that was around it, was end vaccine mandates. You can believe whether or not that was actually, the motivating factor for most of these people or not. But I guess, yeah, that's my question. Is there an ultimate goal like that here that they are organizing for or against?
So they've gone to a bunch of places already. They've gone to Ottawa, Sudbury, Langley, Kelowna, Saskatoon, Edmonton, supposed to be in Hamilton on the 31st of July. And then after that, their only stop left is Halifax. To your second question about what sort of policies are we talking about? I would say that this group is much less focused on policies and what government can do for them. They don't believe government can do anything for them. Basically, this is very simple. This group is promoting this idea that Canada is really for white people and they need to defend Canada against immigrants, against Jewish people, against people who are not white. They might talk a little bit about right-wing talking points like crime and disorder in cities and drug use, but when you drill down into their concerns, it always comes back to race and opposition to immigration. So it's not subtle, and there's not really a policy goal.
Have any of Canada's politicians from any party engaged with them? I think, again, back to the convoy, and there was a lot of discussion and controversy at the time around who would meet with these people and hear their concerns or accept or disavow their support. Is there any engagement like that going on?
Not that I know of. And there was a photo for a couple of years ago of Pierre Poilievre shaking Jeremy Mackenzie's hand. But that was kind of Jeremy had orchestrated that and gone up to an event where anybody can shake Pierre Poilievre's hand. So it was disingenuous. It did not mean that the Conservatives support Diagolon. In fact, Jeremy Mackenzie has actually made threats to sexually assault Pierre Poilievre's wife on a podcast, which he's now being investigated by the RCMP for. So no, as far as I know, no major Canadian politician has stepped foot near this group.
This is something I think about a lot and wrestle with. We wanted to discuss it because we've seen headlines from some of these events and we've heard about what's been said at them. And obviously, there's a concern there and a threat there. But on the other hand, are we, by covering this stuff, especially when, like you said, it's 50 or 60 people and they're at tiny venues, are we giving more oxygen to it than it's worth?
I think it's a really good question. This group has been really aware of the media attention. They often will use some media stories and videos, and they call the news about the tour helpful for the promotion of the tour. They're oh, thanks for the publicity. But I'm actually kind of skeptical of that because we know already that they were speaking to their followers really effectively through their own social media channels before this. I don't think people were, coming to Diagolon through mainstream media. I think it's really important to raise awareness of this group and what they believe. So when I talked to the mayor of Langley, he had no idea who they were or what they were about. He had no idea they'd held an event in his city. But I think it's really important when we're writing about Diagolon, we're not falling into this trap that we're using their framing for their activities. I've seen headlines where they'll say comedy tour, comedy in quotes. And I think it's important for us to just do the basic work of watching their videos, scrolling through their timelines, and it really becomes clear that their attempts at humor are just a smokescreen for this, as I've said, really, really vile ideology that is directed sometimes quite specifically at real people who live in our communities. So don't fall into the trap of saying this is humor, that they don't mean it, that it's just memes and comedy. It's not funny. And I think it's helpful for mayors and other community leaders to really call this out and say it's not welcome.
Jen, thank you so much. As always, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Jen St. Denis, reporting for the Tyee. That was The Big Story. For more, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can find some other episodes that examine how we cover far-right extremism. If you want to talk to us about how we do that, give us some feedback. We would love to hear it. The way to do that is by writing to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving us a voicemail. That number is 416-935-5935. The Big Story is in every single podcast player and on every single smart speaker. And Frequency Podcast Network, the home of The Big Story, now has a network page on YouTube. You can go and subscribe to it for free, of course, and get every single podcast we release in YouTube Music or even just on your YouTube browser on your computer, if that's how you like to listen to things while you pretend to work. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.